Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our event today, hosted by the Canada School of Public Service in conjunction with our partners. Today's event is about leveraging rules as code towards digital transformation. So I hope you're all here for that, this great session. My name is Neil Bauer. I am a Vice President at the Canada School of Public Service, and I'm really happy today to be moderating this session with a fantastic panel that we have. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, but first let me just say that I'm in the National Capital Region. So I'm actually on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people, like many of you. We all work at different places. We're all tuning in probably from different parts of the country. So I certainly invite you to reflect on the First Nations peoples and Indigenous peoples who have occupied the land for time immemorial, and perhaps we could just consider them as we begin our event today. So I am really excited for this event. Rules as Code is a topic which has captured the imagination of policy innovators, of regulators, of governments around the world in the last few years, and we're so very lucky to have taken part in some experimentation in this area. So in fact, ESDC and Labour Canada and the community federal regulators are really leaders in this area in the Government of Canada. But as you'll hear, the Government of France, but also other governments like Australia and New Zealand have been really active in this area. And so today's event is really a chance to talk more about what this means in practice, what does it mean to be experimenting in this space, what is the potential and the promise of rules as code, and also what are some of the learnings, the constructive learnings about it. We'll be talking about some of the projects. And I guess I know for some of us, rules as code is so new, it probably merits a bit of an explanation. So we're going to have a little bit of an explanation, and then we're going to delve into the actual practice. For today's event, we have simultaneous interpretation. So if you would like to participate en français, please take advantage of the simultaneous interpretation. Most of this event will be in English, but there is simultaneous interpretation open to you. Please submit your questions in the language of your choice. Today we will be using WooClap, W-O-O-C-L-A-P, WooClap. So you'll want to go on to www.wooclap.com in order to participate in the Q&A session. And the code for today is code 30, C-O-D-E 30. So please take advantage of this. Not only will you be able to submit your questions and take part in the discussion, you'll be able to upvote other people's questions as well, so to help give momentum to the questions that other people have. So that's wooclap.com, code 30. So let me just introduce the panel to you. We have three amazing panelists on Rules as Code here. They're listed on the screen. Let me start with Pia Andrews, who is the Director General of the Digital Experience and Client Data Workstream at ESDC, where she is one of the leaders on the benefits delivery modernization. She is also an international leader in the area of rules as code, having pioneered work in this area in Australia and New Zealand. So we're really lucky to have Pia with us in the Government of Canada, but also bringing with her some of that international experience. We have also Regan Milosh, who is a developer on Team Babel for Code for Canada. So Code for Canada is sort of the superhero organization of data and digital team members that help bring digital capabilities and data development for the public good. And they work with many departments around town, but they've been working with ESDC in order to help bring the digital capabilities up to speed. And as I mentioned, this is an international effort, and actually the Government of France has been a pioneer in the area of rules as code, and we're really lucky to have Malco Quiroga with us today, who used to work in the Government of France, has been a leader in this area. So welcome to all of our panelists, and we're really thankful that all of you can make the time to be here today. I'm just going to go through a couple of quick slides here. First of all, for those of you that are wondering just what the heck is rules as code, rules as code, the concept is to codify the law of the land, whether that is a legal requirement or whether that is a regulatory requirement or some other requirement. So right now for regulations, of course, we publish regulations in English, we publish regulations in French, and the question is can we publish regulations in code? And why would you do that? Well, you would do that because, first of all, it would make those rules clearer. The discipline of writing something in code forces you to squeeze out the ambiguities and to be clear about what the rules are. So that's one benefit. Another benefit is that if you codify the rules, you allow regulated parties to ingest that code into their own compliance systems. So imagine that you have, a code form of a law. Well, then a company that has software can actually just ingest that code into their compliance systems or into their accounting systems or their HR systems or their operating systems, and they can more easily comply. Imagine, a driverless car downloading the speed limits and therefore knowing the speed limits wherever it drives. That would be sort of rules as code. The other thing that it does for government is it allows government to make service, answering service inquiries better because it can generate chatbots and online tools for rules as code. So for the services, so rather than a human answering questions, a citizen could just go onto an online platform and enter their own information and could see the results of that. Imagine going onto the CRA website to do your taxes, for example. And then finally, it also allows us to experiment with changes in rules, because if we change the rules and change the code, maybe we can simulate the outcomes of different policy changes. So that's sort of the why of rules as code. Just to give you an illustration, many of us have just filed our taxes. If you haven't, I think you have another day before the deadline. But most of us file our taxes on a piece of software. That software or that website has actually encoded the tax regulations and law and all of the calculations that you used to do by pencil and paper and eraser. Now that is done automatically. It's coded into the software, which is amazing. I don't have to say how much of a time saver that is and how much easier it is to comply with complicated tax law when you have a piece of software that helps you. But imagine that instead of a software company figuring that out with a legion of accountants, that actually the government had already figured that out and publishes that code itself to make it easier for people to comply. So that's sort of the concept of rules as code, and it's pretty exciting for regulators. We have done a couple of rules as code projects in the Government of Canada. Those have both involved regulations that come out of the labor program of ESDC. The most recent one is on motor vehicle overtime regulations. So the government has regulations that dictate how many hours a commercial vehicle operator can work under different situations. And all of this is spelled out in a code form, in a regulation, which has to be read by lawyers and interpreted, and the calculations have to be articulated. So what the team did, the team comprised of ESDC, as I mentioned, the labor program, the Department of Justice, the community of federal regulators, and others. They basically took that regulation and they turned it into a concept model and a decision tree. So broke down the logic of the regulation into its component parts, defining the variables, looking at the relationships between them. Then they came up with pseudocode, so it's a step towards actual code, but kind of the logic of code. And then basically they then converted it into actual code, which could be published, and actually was published on GitHub as an actual repository so that anyone can look at it and use that code for their own purposes. And then also interestingly, the team developed a policy difference engine, so sort of a micro simulation platform, so that if you were to tweak the rules or under different situations, you can see the impact of that has following the logic of the rules. And then finally, they developed a prototype for the user to use all of these things productively as a pilot project. So we're going to have a chance to talk more about this project and other ones besides with our great panel. I hope I've done an okay job explaining what rules as code is, but if you're still curious, you can take this QR code and scan it into your phone or your other device, and it will take you to a video that will also, it does a great job of explaining exactly what rules as code is. So if you're still wondering what it is, take a picture of this code. It'll point you to a video. You can save that and watch that later. So I hope that's helpful. What I'd like to do now is basically go through our great panel. These are folks that really have firsthand experience in this area, and basically just ask each of them to tell us, well, what is their perspective on rules as code? What is their experience? And sort of as an opener, what what they'd like to share in terms of their own perspective. And actually, we get to start with Regan, who's got not just a perspective, but he's got some real some things to show for it. So Regan, maybe I could turn it over to you first and just let you tell us, well, first of all, what is your experience with it? And then if you could show us a thing or two, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Neil. So my name is Regan Milosh. I'm a software developer currently working with Code for Canada, currently living in Ottawa, but originally from Regina, Saskatchewan. So Code for Canada is a nonprofit that partners with government agencies to help deliver digital services and promote best practices. It's a 9-month fellowship, and our team of 3 is ingrained within ESDC for this fellowship. We're working on ways of measuring the impact of potential changes to government rules in order to drive evidence-based decision-making. And this has brought us heavily into the rules as code space. So the focus of our fellowship is more related to studying maternity benefits, but Pia invited us to join in on the collaborative rules as code sprint that focused on the motor vehicle regulations. So we joined in as contributors to the development and the design of the system, and we got the chance to work with a very skilled and well-organized group of people. And during the sprint, we worked very closely with policy experts to build out a rules as code engine for these regulations, and we built a prototype for a web application that made use of that rules as code engine, which is the policy difference engine, which I will show right away. Now that the rules as code sprint has been wrapped up, we're refocusing to maternity benefits and looking at ways of expanding and promoting more use cases for rules as code in the organization. So if it's okay, I'll just do a quick demo and explanation of one of the products that came out of the sprint. Okay, so the rules as code sprint, as Neil mentioned, ended up with a few concrete products. So first was the rules as code engine itself. This is an application that encodes the written regulations as precisely as possible. So as we went through the regulations with the experts, we identified some concrete questions that the regulations answer. For example, one of them was how many hours of overtime is a motor vehicle operator entitled to given a particular work schedule. So for a work shift, a motor vehicle operator may work partly as a city operator, partly as a highway operator, a warehouse worker, etc. And those classifications, they have different rules around how many hours of overtime they are entitled to. And overtime for these mixed schedules is a complex calculation. So that's part of what is defined in these regulations, is how to do that calculation. So we captured that in the rules engine. There are other questions as well that are answered by the regulations, such as what is the classification of motor vehicle, depending on some various factors about the nature of your job. It can define you as a city operator, a highway operator, etc. So those are also captured in the rules engine since they were defined in the regulations. So it's very precise in its aims. We're aiming to capture the pure regulations, nothing more and nothing less. So the rules engine itself, it's not something that is directly used by a human. It's the engine that sits behind other applications that the user does interact with. So it might be a chatbot, tool for service agents, as Neil mentioned, HR or accounting applications as well, research tools, things like that. So these are all user-facing applications that have a common need, which is the need for the motor vehicle regulations. And that's what the rules engine provides. Okay, so the second artifact is an example of one of these user-facing applications, and this is the policy difference engine. This is a prototype of a tool for policymakers or researchers that allows them to simulate what might happen if we make some changes to the rules. So again, a question brought about by the regulations is how many hours a motor vehicle operator is entitled to given their work schedule. So on this tool, we can enter in a work schedule that says how many hours they work each day under each classification. So as a city motor vehicle, that's the CMVO, highway motor vehicle, and other. So that could be a warehouse worker, for example. So we can enter in a schedule here. We can enter in if any days were holidays, etc., since that's also captured in the regulations. And yeah, so we'll give our operator a schedule that looks like this. And then down at the bottom here, this is where we can change some aspects of the actual rules. So as we went through the regulations, we found that the values used in the calculation, in the calculation for the overtime hours. So we can think of the rule as being encoded by these numbers. Now we're going to change some of these numbers, which effectively is going to change the rule. So for example, the regulations say that the number of hours that a city motor vehicle operator works before overtime kicks in is 9. So what if we change that to 8? And let's just change a few other numbers here just for fun. And now we're going to run that. And so due to the complexity of these mixed schedules, this isn't exactly a back of the napkin math. It takes something a little bit more heavy duty. So we have two sets of rules here. On the left, we have the original rules, and on the right, we have the proposed changes. When we run this, quite a bit is going to happen under the hood. First, it's going to take this schedule and the first set of rules, and it's going to send that off to the rules engine. That is going to generate a result, which is the number of hours that the schedule is entitled to. Then it's going to take the same schedule and the second set of rules and send that off to the rules engine as well. So it makes a few trips to that rules engine, and then it's going to display the results. So in this case, under the existing regulations, this schedule would be entitled to 2 hours of overtime. In the rule change, so if we were using these proposed changes to the rules, they would be entitled to 4 hours of overtime. So this shows the impact of the change on a single schedule. Now, as I said, this is a prototype of a tool that could be used by researchers and policymakers. So a potential next step would be to gather data on a ton of schedules, so real data, and run all of those against the proposed rule change. Then we can see the aggregate impact of all of the overtime hours, and this drives evidence-based decision-making. So there's a demo of a user-facing web application that is built on top of a rules as code engine.
Amazing. Well, thanks, Regan. It's great to see the application of it. I know there is a lot behind the hood. What's also really interesting to me is the fact that that's authoritative. So that's not like that's not like somebody's best guess or somebody's reading or interpretation. Working with the folks that designed the regulation, working with the experts that administer the program, they've validating that this is actually an authoritative source. So really, really great. Thank you for that. Malcolm, maybe I could ask you next to just sort of share with us your perspective on rules as code, what your experience has been, and just to help us get started.
Yes, thanks, Neil. I'm amazed about the work that you've done. It's a very, very interesting. So a bit about my background. So I used to work for the French Prime Minister, specifically for Genome, which is the equivalent of CDS in Canada, I guess, or Canadian Digital Services. And so the mission is to implement what we call government as a platform. That means making it easier for government to collaborate with citizens thanks to technology. So using data, APIs, just a way of machines talking to machines in order to ask for some information, and in new ways of developing digital public services that allows for better collaboration between agents and citizens. And so at some point, the question was, so if we are actually creating APIs that allows to question government some different informations, why can't we just do that with the rules, with the legislation? I mean, can we API-fy? Can we just create a machine that's going to be there and we can ask, hey, how does this actual rule applies to me? And then we say, okay, so we have the data as well. So if we have the data and have the API, why cannot just be a implement a way of knowing if someone has to pay taxes or can access some social benefits? And so, that's how we started working. And we didn't call it rules as code in France. That we owe that, I guess, to PIA and the work that they've done in New Zealand and in Australia. But we call that transformer la loi en code informatique. In French, it's like turn law into code. And specifically, we started working with OpenFisca. So I'm a maintainer of OpenFisca. And so the basic thing was to realize that there is some sort of algorithms embedded in the law, with the rules. So there is some specific ways the legislator wants things to be applied, but they are not explicit, so they are opaque for the citizen. And so how can we actually leverage technology in order to make those things clearer or more transparent? So again, so how much taxes do I owe? To which social benefits I am entitled to? And so rules as code for me is basically this opportunity of making these algorithms that are already present in the law and the legislation, making those algorithms easier for governments to design, to implement, for citizens as well to understand what are the impacts and how those algorithms are going to apply to their own particular situation. And finally, to the society in general, to scrutinize. So those are, for me, the opportunities with rules code.
Amazing. Well, that's fantastic. It's really neat to hear that, sounds like the government of France came to it sort of independently, but then joined up with sort of the other international players in doing it. When we come back for Q&A, I want to hear more about some of the use cases that you explored in France. That's amazing. Maybe we could turn then to Pia, who, like I say, has a background both internationally as well as now in the government of Canada on this. Pia, what's your take? What's your perspective on rules as code?
Well, thank you so much. This is one of those areas that where the policy delivery continuum, having been years apart, is starting to smush together out of necessity. So the fact is, and I'm seeing all the questions coming up on WooClap, and there's some excellent questions we'll get to soon. But one of the key things that a lot of policy folk and drafters don't seem to realize is that all of your rules are in code now. They're just being encoded into opaque business systems in governments, in organizations, in software, all over the place. So a lot of the problems of, well, what if it's translated wrong, happen today. A lot of the issues are around how are we certain that the business decision that comes out of an application or out of a service is correct, is often pretty opaque and pretty difficult to actually get that traceability, because right now all of those things are done behind the scenes or under the cover. So rules as code isn't technically new. The idea of code, of legislation, regulation and other rules being encoded into business system has been around since computers have been around. The big difference with what we're proposing is twofold. First of all, rules as code itself, when you actually, as Marco and the team have been absolute exemplars for internationally, and the rest of us are rapidly catching up, is identified that if you actually take your pure legislation, your pure regulation, and make that available as computer software, as effectively computer code, but openly and transparently, a couple of benefits happen. First of all, everyone can have a reference implementation that they can test against, can check against, and that can actually be kept up to date itself. And when issues emerge or interpretations change or whatever, you can at least update that and have lots of applications then draw from the same reference implementation, from the same interpretation, if you like. And that transparency dramatically helps with traceability, because you're now not smushing together legislation and operating policy. You're keeping legislation pure, and you're then able to check back against legislation. There are many cases around the world we have found, and I have found in my teams, where the operational policy has actually conflicted with the legislation, but in the implementation that's not picked up and it's just applied. And then you end up with services or calculations or eligibility not maintaining that superiority of the law as the greater authority over operating policy. So the first big difference here is we're trying to actually make the rules that are applied from legislation and regulation more open, more available, more transparent, and more traceable. The second big difference, which goes to what Neil and Regan have spoken to, and this is where New Zealand and Australia did take some big steps, but those are big steps happening everywhere now, starting to as well, is actually looking at the drafting process itself. The realization we had was that if we keep just trying to, even if you have open rules as code, open legislation and regulation as code, the actual drafting process misses the opportunity. In the drafting process, in the policy development process, if you have multidisciplinary teams, if you actually do isomorphic simultaneous drafting of both a human and machine version of your new regulation, new legislation, a couple of really interesting things happen. First of all, it gives you a chance to test your assumptions, to get very clear your concept models, to get very clear what the impact is supposed to be, and to test that. And you're testing it ahead of anyone else implementing it, so it gives you a better chance of your human version being clear and being concise and having the intended effect. The second impact it has is that you've now got a reference implementation, which means that if you wanted to make that available, then when the new law is passed, the implementation time goes very, very fast. I might just very quickly, if you don't mind, share my screen just for a second. And what I'm going to do is just show you very briefly these two diagrams. Very, very simple. The current state of rules as code is that you've got some, legislation policy exists. Everyone does their own interpretation. Everyone creates their own specifications to implement. And quite often it's, again, as I said, mashed up with the operational policy or system limitations or even ideology of whoever is implementing it, which means you get a complete inconsistency of that translation, interpretation, and codification. And then, of course, you get myriad efforts to, on the back of those interpretations, you get myriad implementations, and you have no line of sight, you have no traceability, you have no visibility, and you don't have the ability to assure that the rules are being applied in the way that they were meant, let alone having the intended effect, because it's completely opaque. This model is really trying to get to having a common concept model up front. What is the point of this? How is it supposed to work in easy to understand language that any discipline, anyone can then apply? Then to co-draft human and machine readable rules using a test-driven approach, human-centered driven approach, and then you actually start to build the test cases. So one of the questions was around how to ensure no conflicts emerge. The real value and beauty of this is that you can either develop or generate, loads of test cases to say, if I put in this input, what output should I get? And then you can hold that test. You develop those tests with the policy people, with the drafters, and then anytime there's a change to the rules, you can run your hundreds or thousands or millions potentially of tests to say, did it meet the outcome that we expect? And if not, is it because the rules had the unintended effect, or is it because the rules been implemented wrongly? Now you've got a human readable and machine readable form. So the human readable form would go through Parliament in our thinking, but the machine readable form is available as a, if you like, reliable interpretation that anyone can then use. And then you can actually have that visibility. Imagine if you had an API for government legislation. And again, this applies for prescriptive rules or where precedence is well set rather than judgment-based. But even being able to say, before you come in to get the judgment for something like citizenship, at least here are the eligibility criteria that are prescriptive, to get to before then, but you can still maintain that those judgments, of course. The point is that if you have an API from government for leveraging these rules, you can now assure testing, you can assure implementation, you can have automated auditing and compliance tools. And most importantly, of course, you can actually monitor for patterns and anti-patterns of use of those rules. So I'll just take down my little diagrams. So there's lots of opportunities in this space to get consistency between how the rules are applied for service delivery, for regulation, and for policy monitoring, management, and reform over time, right? I'll just, so there's projects around this that I've been involved in personally in at least 3 countries so far. And I can tell you in each one, even just getting together the different disciplines has led to profoundly better outcomes for everyone involved. The final just intro statement I'll say is I've got some some very new intelligence to share, and so you're all getting some new ideas out of this session that I haven't shared before, just because they're coming out of work that's happening in New Zealand right now. But one of them is that there's a pattern. For a lot of you that are regulators, you know the pattern of regulation, the structure and operating model for regulation is actually quite a repeatable pattern across government, right? You have the regulations, you have the people who assure that the regulations are being applied correctly by the regulated entities, right? You have the means of assuring compliance, you have the means of spot checking, you have the means of testing against your intended effect, and you're monitoring for the impacts of your regulation. Isn't it interesting to realize that there is no equivalent pattern for legislation? Even though legislation is just it is the same as regulation, it just happens to be implemented in government. Where are our independent checks that the business systems of government are implementing the rules consistently and correctly, the same that we have for the regulation pattern? So there's some interesting things there to consider, and I'll share some more ideas as we go through the panel. But thank you very much. It's really great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Amazing. Thank you, Pia. I really like the point you made in the opening that there are already codes inherent in all of our regulations. In fact, we used to call it, or maybe we still do, the labor code, the criminal code. But what we're talking about here really is a different kind of code. It's machine readable code, and it's authoritative machine readable code. And I know we've been looking at the woo clap here, and it's true, the questions have been coming in fast and furious. But let me just at the very beginning just take one of these questions, because I think it's a foundational one. Someone asked, would the rules be written as code, be written in plain English or French, or remain in legalese? So maybe I could just ask you first of all, maybe Regan, can you just tell us a little more exactly what it means? What does it look like, the actual code of it? If you were to look at the code, could you just explain a little bit what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So for the rules engine piece itself, we were actually building on the Open Fisca platform that Mako has mentioned that he's maintaining. So we really were building on some work already done, and it really is an international effort. So that specifically it's written, it uses Python, the programming language. So that's what is currently being used for it. And throughout that demo that I was showing, I was mentioning that the rules, they can be encoded or captured in some cases in a set of numbers. So those motor vehicle regulations, we kind of encoded some of those regulations as a set of numbers. So it's like the thresholds for how many hours a city motor vehicle operator works before overtime kicks in, etc. So in some cases, so in the case of the motor vehicle regulations, we were able to distill that down to a set of those properties. And once you're able to do that, then the language, it's very flexible. So it could be ultimately it will need to be in code somehow, but the better you can encode it, I guess the more readable that code could end up being, and the more accessible it would be to non-developers, I would say. And that's not going to be I couldn't say if that's the case for all regulations. It worked out really well with the one that we were doing. But there's so many regulations and legislation out there, it would remain to be seen how easy that is with those other ones.
Okay, so it's fair to say it's not really written in English or French, it's written in Python, and it has the definitions of different variables, the relationships, the arithmetic between them is spelled out, and the output is also spelled out in Python script. So it really is a different thing. Malcolm, do you want to get in on that?
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to jump in because Pia talked about prescriptive rules or regulation, and I just wanted to say, I mean, what does it mean in terms of Python? So we talk about prescriptive when a rule is complete in terms of how we can make a decision. So if the rule already has all the conditions, and we only need some data, and each time we apply the same data and each time we have the same result, we say that is prescriptive, basically. And so it's OpenFiscal in particular is very, very, very useful for those kind of rules because those are just conditions or kind of mostly arithmetical operations. So if I owe or I own a house, if I got 2 children, if I have this salary, and so it's really, really useful for that. And it is more complicated when you have to decide with fuzzy or when you don't have all the information. It's like, oh, but he did this, and maybe the legislation applies in different ways. So that's where the difference. Yeah, sorry. I was just to say that for this kind of legislation is very, very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think, in law and in regulations, usually you want things to be clear. You don't want them to be ambiguous. So I guess there's probably a lot of areas of law and regulations where rules as code is good because, as you say, it's very prescriptive that you go, okay, so let's just check in. If people are still wondering, like, what exactly is rules as code, let me give you each to give 3 words that describes rules as code. If you could just, in a nutshell, describe rules as code with 3 words, what 3 words would you use? Regan, you first.
Sure. Okay, so I would say precise, reusable, and collaborative. Those would be the 3. I can let those speak for themselves, or I could elaborate.
But let's see if we got other words. Malcolm, how about you?
Thank you. That's interesting. I have 3 different words. The first one is trust. Usually relationship with citizens, between citizens and government should be trustful, but they're not. So I think rules as code helps to achieve that. The second one is a rather special one. It's a conviviality. Usually relationship between government and citizens, it's like more like a contentious one. And actually rules, law, legislation itself should be a base for conviviality, basically between citizens and government. So rules as code helps to achieve that as well. And of course, transparency. We already talked about how rules today are opaque for citizens, and they should not.
Love it. Pia.
Thank you for letting me go last. I'm sorry, to the other two. I'm going to actually build on the other two, but the first one is machine readable. This is critical. And I'm going to give you an example of this in a minute if you don't mind. We actually experimented in, no, sorry, I'll come back to the three words. So machine readable, I'm counting as hyphenated. Auditable / verifiable / testable. Like it gives you the chance to have something which is verifiable and traceable. What does the actual legislation say? What is the actual law? Too often, well, right now, everywhere that rules are implemented into systems that that blends the law with internal policy and in fact with operating norms, and there is not that traceability through to this decision was made based on our rules engine. Okay, but is it lawful? And as I said, we have found lots and lots of cases where can I quickly screen share just for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to give an example of this.
Yeah, for sure.
So in Australia, we were experimenting when I was working for the anti-money laundering, for the financial regulator, and anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing regulation is a big area, and there's lots of areas of it that are prescriptive. You know, if a transaction is more than $10,000, you have to report it. Okay, cool. But then there's lots of areas that are judgment-based, right? Just the prescriptive areas, after working with banks and several regulated entities, if we just made the prescriptive rules available as an API from the regulator that the regulated entities could use, just one of them told us it would save them $16 million a year. It's a big deal to be constantly identifying, interpreting, applying, and then praying that you've applied it correctly so you don't get sued for non-compliance, right? But I'll just quickly show you one of the things we found in the work there was that trying to find the perfect way to write regulation that both captured the nuance and precision of human language, particularly legal language, and was machine understandable. The conclusion we came to was that was not possible. There's lots of people that keep trying to do it, but actually the needs are different. Humans need precision, and the human version of the law will always be the one upheld in the courts. Machines need, if you try to make a machine read what's good for a machine will get a different outcome. If you try to make a human read what's good for a machine, the human's going to, get annoyed, generally, unless they're like us. So trying to actually create something that does both is silly. So actually getting an isomorphic dual translation is better. Here's the machine version, here's the human version. How do you know the machine version is the same as the human version? Through tests. Here are all the test cases. So I'll just quickly show you something. In New Zealand, one of the pieces of regulation that legislation that we're working on is the Rates Rebate Act. This is the calculation. And I'm just, for those who can't sort of see this, I just want to quickly read it out. A ratepayer who at the commencement of the rating year was the ratepayer of a residential property is entitled on application of that year to a rebate of so much of the rates payable for that rating year in respect to the property as represents 2/3 of the amount by which those rates exceed $160, reduced by $1 for every $8, by which the ratepayer's income by the preceding tax year exceeded blah, blah, like it is hard to read. It is hard to understand even for a human. And guess what? It was implemented wrong. It turns out that's a quadratic equation. Cool. Year 7 mathematics came back. But when we implemented it, we found, oh, hold on, our calculation's different from the actual government application unit thing. And we went back and said, okay, can we have a look at your code? No. Okay, can we look at what you based it on? So again, the lack of transparency was interesting. They showed us the spreadsheet. It was a 30-year-old spreadsheet that had taken each line of that piece of regulation and tried to figure out what it means. And guess what? Halfway through the calculation, halfway through the series of macros they'd done, they just rounded a number down, because it was convenient to someone at some point to round that number down, and it threw the calculation out. And they said, are we overpaying or underpaying? We said, you're overpaying. They said, well, that's all right. I love New Zealand. But the point is that what's for a human reading that, and the lawyers that wrote it, that was the most precise way to write it. Could it be read more simpler? Sure. A machine just needs, it's this times this divided by this, blah, 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 and you can have the different variables. But a human doesn't think in code, and a machine doesn't think in prose. Capturing both both is actually really important.
Wow. So so you're saying not only is it better for the rule maker because it helps them to be more articulate, and not only is it better for the person that is receiving the rules because it helps them to clarify and so on, but also you were talking about the dynamic of having those folks talking to one another and being part of the policy process, which is also absolutely fascinating. So, so someone is asking, how do they know if their own work is conducive to rules as code? So maybe, Malcolm, maybe I could start with you this time. Just if you could say something about, if you're in government, you're in a service or in a program or in a regulatory function, what are things you should be looking for if you're interested in rules as code to know whether or not this is an area that's relevant for you?
Thanks, Neil. The answer to that question is basically infinite, but I have a couple of examples. So the thing is, like, of course, the rules as code is already a conclusion of a lot of experience with dealing with some public policy problems and service delivery. So I have three that I have seen myself as a civil servant. So the first one is, so I am a civil servant and I'm working with citizens, and I usually I have to answer questions about social benefits eligibility, or how do I actually understand some pieces of legislation. Am I usually going back to ask my colleagues or the text or etc. So if you do that on a current basis, basically that's one way, so one field of rules as code, and that's interesting to you. So in France, we've developed one service which is called MEZ, or my social benefits. So it was intended for citizens to better understand their eligibility to social benefits. But the thing is that people, even though they can use a digital service, they still going to go to ask civil servants whether or not they're eligible, because there is this trust relationship that's basically the foundation between citizens and governments. And guess what? Civil servants started using this same service in order to answer citizens. So it's called mediation or the mediation. So the rules as code is it is the contrary of actually suppressing all the jobs of people answering to citizens. It is actually for civil servants answering questions to citizens to improve that relationship. So and especially the most difficult questions, the ones that are really hard to calculate, then rules as code is going to help you to give a better answer. So that is just one example. The second one, as we've talked already, is when you're a legislator. And this is really interesting because now with the COVID crisis, especially in local governments, the question is, so we have some money now to spend in order to provide for more disposable income for citizens. And so we say, oh, so can we actually implement new social benefits? Or can we implement new taxes or other dispositions, etc.? And so if you're addressing a specific target of your constituents and you don't know how to do it, or basically rules as code is a tool that you can leverage for designing and testing, as Pia said, how better target this how better design and target this new legislations that you want to implement. And finally, of course, it could happen that you're actually a software developer or economist or policy drafter working somewhere in order to implement some policy that's already been decided. Let's say that it's already been decided, and as well as Pia already said, you have to actually make these decisions about, oh, should I run it up or down? So of course, in that scenario as well. If you're facing that scenario, rules as code as well, it's something that could be relevant to you. So that's just kind of three examples, but of course there are more.
I love it. Now, someone has also asked along that vein, and maybe Pia, I can turn this one to you. Like, so is this better as a top-down exercise, or better as a bottom-up exercise in terms of the way that we approach rules as code? So would it be better if somebody said, let's conceive of this as rules as code, kind of the leadership pushing it down, or is it better to kind of empower people and let them bring it up from the base? What do you think about that?
Oh, I never believe anything should ever be only entirely driven from the top down. It tends to be a little disempowering. I think that there's a couple of aspects here. First of all, if you are a rules maker, if you're a person who does policy, who does drafting, having a look at some of these cases from around the world, listening to your peers who are working in rules making, who are getting benefit from engaging with, crazy folk like me, and not necessarily me, but the benefits of having technologists in the room while you're making your rules might help you. If you are a person who uses rules because you build services, you build systems, you build translators, you build dashboards or monitoring or measurement systems. If you're on the implementation fence, then consider the idea that rather than taking the traditional, all right, then operating policy will go and figure it all out. I'll get the requirements and I'll just go and build whatever I'm told. Actually just ask the question, how are we going to make sure that this is meeting the legislation? How can we see the legislation? When a decision's being made by my system, how can I test it, either test it against the rules or have traceability to the rules? Either or both, by the way. You don't have to do rules as code, like a legislation as code system for every application. But you could say, okay, well, why don't we have just the legislation as code for our department as a system that sits over here? And then all of our business systems could at least test against it. Because if something is conflicting with the law, then either the interpretation of it is wrong, that's a possibility, and you need to test that. But if it's right, if it definitely says the person gets it if they're 18 and at 19 the test case over here is failing, then there's something wrong over here. So it gives you a chance to actually fix and make sure that your rules are in alignment with the law, and it gives you a chance to make sure that your operational policy isn't conflicting with or undermining the law, which sometimes can happen unintentionally. It's never on purpose these things happen, but they do. So I think, so bottom up, everyone can benefit from having a look at considering these kinds of concepts. Top down, I think the key thing is to actually say, when are we going to draw the line in the sand? When are we going to say, well, would it make sense at some point, as was a recommendation in the New South Wales government in Australia when they did a massive review of regulation just a couple of years ago, their actual recommendation was to draw a line in the sand and say, let's decide a date, and then from then on, all rules would take a better rules approach, this kind of co-drafting, isomorphic drafting approach, in order to get that line in the sand moving forward. So you can actually not just get the benefit to the authoritative version, the English or French, but the human readable version. But you could also have your reference implementation in code from day one. So I think that line in the sand needs to happen at some point, and that would impact change to policy development and legislative regulatory drafting guidelines, and that would lead to systemic approach. It's worth quickly acknowledging that CSPS is taking a real leadership role as leadership and facilitator role in this, and it is actually in huge due to your efforts that this is moving so fast in Canada, and that's a real enabler. I personally, and I look at this space globally, there's great work happening in other countries, but the combination of looking at the rules as code, just as implementation side, and policy transformation in Canada, I think puts you easily in the top few countries in the world looking at policy transformation and how to close the gap between policy and implementation, which has grown to a chasm over the last few decades. So that you're in a really good position to be able to address that. So bottom up and top down needs to happen. But that only happens when people see the benefit, and hopefully this will help with some of that.
Nice. Well, and to give credit where credit is due, I will say that the community of federal regulators, the labor program at ESDC, not to mention ESDC more generally, as well as a constellation of other regulators that have been interested in this in the government of Canada, have really been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, supported, of course, by the team at the Canada School. There are a few questions here about like what happens when you run into a rule or a regulation that is qualitative. And the example from WCLAP is, medically assisted dying regulations, for example, or, you can think of other places where a regulation calls for human judgment. There's also a question about whether there's conflicts or ambiguities in the regulations. If you're trying to code them, that must pose real challenges. Maybe I could just ask each one of you to comment, maybe starting with you, Regan, just to ask you to comment, like, what do you do if you're trying to encode a regulation or a written rule set, and then you find something that is deeply subjective or ambiguous or in fact conflicts internally with something else? What do you do in that situation, Regan?
Yeah, we had a little bit of an experience throughout this project that I think I could speak to on that, especially the ambiguity part. So as we were working with the policy experts to really understand the rules and get them into that machine readable format, so we would be taking a bunch of examples of work schedules, for example, and say, okay, let's step through the calculation, let's build this flow chart, and let's really get precise to see like what is each step involved in this calculation, so we can arrive at that number. And as we were doing that's the part that really brought to light certain ambiguities that were in the regulation. So we had some spots where there's some pieces that are maybe implied by the regulations, but if you were to actually code that, how it's written, then there's a bit of a conflict. So there's a conflict in how it's actually implemented, so according to the experts and people who have worked in the industry, and then a conflict about what's in the regulations and what's actually written down. And so it definitely does beg the question, okay, which one are we going to write into the code? So for this case, like we kind of weigh the pros and cons of say like, okay, do we want to do it the way that it's inferred, or do we want to do it the way that it's written? In this case, we went with the way that they, what was implied by the rules, with like a very special sticky note saying like, for future consideration, next time these regulations get worked with, maybe this is something to bring up for some rewording to make it very precise and aligned with what is used in practice. And one idea that kind of came up is this idea, building on the this testability idea that Pio was mentioning. If you have two different interpretations of the rules, then one option that you have is to run tests on those. So you can encode both versions of those rules if there is an ambiguity. So say this ambiguity splits it into 2 or possibly 3 or 4 different versions of the rules. You could encode all 4 of those versions, or however many you need, bring in the real data, and then you can run the rules against all of that data, all of those test cases, and you can see what the impact is. So you can get that data. You can get numbers driven by the real data, and that can help you inform the decision-making process.
That's brilliant. So where there's ambiguity, you can actually see if it makes a difference or what kind of a difference it makes. That's really interesting. Malco, how about you for these cases that are sort of more subjective, or that where there might be ambiguities or conflict? Any experience or perspective on that?
Yeah, thanks. This is my revenge because I wanted to address this point before, but it wasn't that clear. So I think that there are 2 different cases. So we're talking about prescriptive rules, and it could be that though some prescriptive rules are ambiguous in their interpretation, or it could be that the rules are just not prescriptive and that they require by design human judgment. So I just wanted to make it clear that for me, those rules that require human judgment are not the target of rules as code. So of course, we could talk about machine learning or artificial intelligence. I think it's not the primary target of rules as code, and we are really trying to say that humans are hero-prone when it comes to repetitive tasks. So whenever something is prescriptive, we should delegate that to machines because they're more proficient and more efficient in doing that. And the inverse is also true. When we actually require human judgment, it is not machines that we should use, it's actually humans. So the first thing for me is if we really require judgment, we just don't use versus code. I mean, we have humans for that. So that's the first part of the answer. And the second one, of course, we, as Pia said before, the things that we already do, we already kind of face ambiguities in rules, but like really quietly, in closed doors. And usually are developers that have to deal with that while developing expert systems. So I think that there is not it is not about like how do I actually code those rules, but basically how do I actually open a conversation about this situation, and getting people out of those closed doors and going backwards when the actual rules are being designed, and have that conversation before. That's for me the importance of rules. So yeah, we shouldn't have to decide in the last responsible moment how to interpret rules that should be clear from the outset.
Right. I know this is music to your ears, Pia, but did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly. I think you covered it really well, Marco. And it does then, I think for everyone out there who is actually a rule maker, this is something to really consider carefully. When do you want to use a principle-based approach, and when do you want to use a prescriptive-based approach? Because I think that over the years, this has become a bit of a trend. People tend to go all prescriptive or all principles, and right now we're very much on the tail end of an era of principles-based is king, and everything should be a principle. So the real question is, it's not about either. It's not about one or the other. It's about how to use both responsibly. If you want something consistently applied, you need to prescribe it. If you want judgment involved, you need to not prescribe it. And I'll give a very simple example. So in New Zealand, as I think is in most countries, but we were specifically working with the legislation around citizenship, right? And to become a citizen, there are both a combination of prescriptive and judgment-based rules, right? Prescriptive-based rules, you have to have been in the country for X amount of years. You need to meet certain things. You need to not be from certain countries unless you meet extra tests. You need to, there are very specific citizen prescriptive rules. And then on top of that, you need to meet the good character test, which you want to keep as a judgment-based rule. There is an officer that you interview with, and they do that, right? Now, you don't want to automate this because, that would create bias and issues and doesn't reflect the changing values of the community and of the society. But you don't want to make principles based, if you think you should. You don't want to, if you want particular benefits to target, people who are over 18, you should say, after they turn 18. Or once a person turns 18, which implies on their 18th birthday. You shouldn't say once a person, is mature. You shouldn't say once a person is X height. You want to be fairly prescriptive about that. So please, please, please consider carefully. A principle is for where humans and judgment is important, and prescriptive is where you want to have consistency of application. And if you want to test that, test with people like us. With the Holidays Act in New Zealand, which is the regulation that determines holiday pay, they left a whole bunch of it quite judgment-based, and it was implemented differently by everyone, including the department that actually administered it. And it led to millions, billions of dollars of mispayments, right? And we used that as our target case in New Zealand about 3 years ago, and for 3 weeks. And we had the policy writer, the drafter, and one of the developers from a payroll company who had implemented it, right, in the room together with us and a few other people. And it was so interesting because the policy person was like, okay, well, here's what I was trying to do. And they're like, oh, well, here's how I interpret it. But why would you interpret it that way? Well, why would you write it that way? What it led to, of course, and this goes to one of the other questions, is just a concept model, a common picture that says, here's the logical flow of how this is supposed to work and what the outcome is supposed to be. And when you actually go through the process of developing a concept model with a multidisciplinary team, and then you publish that concept model, that becomes part of your reference implementation for how the rules should be implemented, because it becomes part of your test. And then you have the rules, and then you have your test suite. Okay, then for a person with these criteria, once you go through the flowchart, should they get it, yes or no? Once you have this criteria, how much should they get? This much. Okay, so you have your tests against your concept model defined here, so that once you codify your rules, you can then run your tests and see, does it have the outcome? And the policy people can play a really strong role in defining those tests, because then you can run your test against your system and see if it has the outcome that you expect. Yeah, so that testing approach is really critical, but I think Marco put it most eloquently. Let machines do what machines do well, let humans do what humans do well, and then we will be able to get both the consistency of what should be consistent and maintain a values-based, judgment-based approach where we want to have that.
I'm really glad I'm glad, Pia, that you mentioned the decision tree again. When I was looking at that picture from the last sprint that had the the concept model, and then the decision tree, then the pseudocode, and then the code. What I was thinking about that was that, I think many departments would find that really interesting in and of itself, for training, for dialogue, to make sure that things are clear. And so there's value even in that process of it, but then there's value in the code itself. So we've got a few questions now about the future. So let's say that rules as code takes off, and that regulators and departments start using rules as code more, more in a more mainstream way. How do you think that will affect the policymaking process, or how do you think that will affect the implementation of rules going forward? If you could project forward 10 years, and Malcolm, maybe I'll start with you. If you could project forward 10 years into the future, and just what would be different in government, in regulators and regulated parties, if rules of code takes off and goes on fire, what do you think will be different in the future?
Thanks, Neil. This is a really, really interesting question, because I've been imagining this for a while now. We've been saying that the problem today is that everything works in silos, right? So we have policy drafters somewhere, so legislator, the executive, developers. And so the thing is, beyond technology, we should just change this management. There's a paradigm shift in management in government. And so we basically need to get all these people working together from the outset and throughout the design, implementation, delivery, and improvement. And so what basically we're saying is that legislation is, or rulemaking or policy making is not just drafting and writing rules, but it's actually delivering the services that we want with those rules. And this is a whole process that we're going to consider. So for me, the future is that, as Pia said, we'll get data scientists with all the data sets necessary, and the designers and policy drafters to imagine what the needs of society are, and how we can actually design that in a way of new rules. And developers are going to test those at the same time. And in a day or two, or with a sprint of a week, we're going to have everybody working together before we actually go to vote new rules. And then once we vote them, automatically they're going to become available in different ways as authoritative algorithms that others could implement by themselves. And of course, government as well, either authoritatively or in a subsidiary way, that depends on the kind of government you have. They also can provide an API that's going to make for others available these rules in terms of code. And all of that is going to provide us with a way for citizens to scrutinize and to correct, to try to find the bug bounties in legislation and give them the way of proposing changes and creating a new way of the collaboration between government and citizens. So that's kind of my vision of in 10 years. It's a little bit inspired with, of my work in government as a software developer, but that's more or less the way I see it, an agile policy making process.
I like it. There's a lot of really digitally transformational terms that you're drawing on. So Pia, let me,
Sorry.
no, that's a good thing. So Pia, let me throw it over to you and ask you to cast forward and think about the transformational potential for rules as code.
Thank you very much. The first one is, and it shouldn't be such a big thing to imagine, but I'd like to get to, frankly, where France is already at to some degree, to a large degree. I just want to catch up with where they're at, where when a new change or net new piece of legislation or regulation is being drafted, that they can test that change against the regime, at least across the social services and financial, because the taxation, because those two things combined, social services and tax, have a huge financial implication for citizens. So being able to say, when I make this change, what impact does it have for people, for society across the domain is very important. Even in the small project we did with the Labour team that Regan presented so well, almost immediately you start talking about, what's the actual purpose of regulating this? And partly it's about the amount that people are being paid, but partly, but there's an immediate link to safety. Well, if a person's driving too many hours, what's the implications of safety? And the answer, of course, is, oh no, that's in the transport regulation. It's a separate piece of regulation, so it doesn't matter. It's like, how about we map both so that once a person hits the threshold that they know is an unsafe amount of hours to drive, that there can be some sort of, even if they meet this regulation, we should probably make sure that they're not going to, crash and hurt someone. So that cross-regulatory, having our rules, at least certain domains of rules, certain domains of prescriptive rules available openly, will allow us to test against many rules. So that we get out of the sort of siloed approach where rules makers are testing against either the act or the domain or the department, but never across all of government in Canada. So I'd like to get to that point. I'd like to have traceability of laws so that it is easy to audit and appeal a decision legally. And so anyone can see this decision was made based on this piece of legislation, based on this law, this piece of regulation, whatever. And then to be able to have automated auditability and monitoring for anti-patterns. There's something new happening over here. Why is that? Oh, it's because people's use of this device is actually changing the outcome for that piece of regulation, or because there's, COVID hit. And so a lot of our assumptions about rules in social services, suddenly massive gaps emerged. Like a lot of these gaps could have been identified in advance through having access to the rules and being able to run modelling against them. But the final thing I'll say, and Malcolm started to touch on it, but I want to just take it a little further, is about community engagement. So in Australia quite recently, a really amazing group of Indigenous leaders got together and talked about the Indigenous protocols for AI, for artificial intelligence. And they were looking at, how to actually bring Indigenous knowledge systems into, not just into technology, but into a world where technology is so dominant. And one of the ideas that we played with is actually if they took and again, there's so many rules in their law that are prescriptive as well, and a whole bunch that are judgment based. But if we took some of those rules and made them like their own rules as code for Indigenous protocols and laws, then when the government proposes new legislation or regulation, they can actually run those rules against their own systems to say, well, actually, this thing you're doing here is actually contradictory or conflicting with our way of living, with our rules, with our law. So I think that actually gets quite profound when you start thinking about, yes, there's law in the, what the courts will uphold sort of approach, but then there's being able to identify where things conflict with effectively different value systems. And that gets quite profound and quite outside of the scope of pretty much most of us. But I think it becomes an interesting future to start looking at where communities are a bit more empowered to say, for this community living in this way, we have a different idea of what good looks like, and we're going to use these tools, all of these tools, to help inform our engagement with government accordingly.
I'm glad you brought up the interjurisdictional angle, because some of us think that rules don't change very often. So, coding them, if they don't change, if they never change, you might say, well, why code them? I mean, once people read them, they'll know them and they'll never have to change them again. But in fact, if people go from province to province or country to country or territory to territory, they'll be experiencing different rule sets from those authorities. So actually having those rules encoded, even if they don't change, is important, because the people that are subject to those rules move between those jurisdictions. So that's a really interesting point. Regan, how about you? Thinking 10 years in the future, rules of code gone wild, what are some things that you would think of in that context?
Yeah, for sure. So I see a lot more a closed knowledge gap between the tech and policy. So more technical literacy on the policy side, and then more policy expertise on the technical side as well. We found that was like one of the obstacles that we needed to overcome for our process, was to make sure that the policy experts felt comfortable with the technology that was involved, in terms of are these systems going to be secure? Is everybody going to be able to see this? How open is it going to be? Like, what is source control? So we actually put together kind of a knowledge translation project to help bridge that gap. So I see that playing a role in the future, is making sure that we close that knowledge gap between tech and policy, so that the policy experts are aware of the important pieces. They don't need to be expert software developers, and the software developers don't need to be experts in policy, but at least closing the gap a little bit. I also see a more efficient development process for these types of applications. The idea of the rules as code is that you have this one authoritative source for the rules, so you don't, other development teams, if you're developing a new application like an HR or accounting system, you don't need to spend time reinterpreting those rules. That interpretation happens once, and then everybody can use that system. And now, if you are doing only one interpretation, then you need to make very, very sure that it is precise and it's the right one. And that's why the policy experts, that this collaborative aspect of it between the policy experts and the coders is so important. You need both of those perspectives on it. And I don't necessarily see it, definitely not replacing any sort of human decision-making aspect. We can build, it facilitates the building of models to help inform decision-making processes. Simulations are models. They're not perfect. There may be some data that is being left out. And I think that's why it's very important to stress that these systems are completely open, so that anybody can look at the inner workings, scrutinize it, and point out ways to make it better, whether that be missing data or, even if it's like a bug in the code or something like that. Yeah, I see more technical literacy, more efficient process for it, and the simulated models helping the decision-making process.
Fantastic. Well, I think offhand you answered two of the other questions that were on WooClap, one of which is this sort of coders just doing their own interpretation of rules, or are the experts actually involved? And I think your point, and the point that everyone's made, is that no, this is a collaboration, and we're relying really heavily on the policymakers and the implementers to talk together about to help clarify the code. And Excellent. I think you also spoke a bit to the skill sets required for rules of code, which is really, cross-disciplinary skills and being able to integrate and collaborate to pick one of the key words that you guys mentioned. So we're getting close to the end. I'm going to ask one other question, and then I'll also then give you each a chance to just say some last messages that you want to leave with people about the projects we've worked on and about rules as code as an area. But the question that is, I'm going to put two of them together. One of the questions is how can we build our capacity in government to do this kind of work, given that it is a big culture shift and requires better integration and accessibility? And the other kind of part of that is also around part of that culture shift, inclusiveness. And somebody asked the very perceptive question about whether sex and gender-based analyses or other analyses, can be opened up through rules as code. So just if I could ask each of you to comment on how do we help with the culture shift and the capacity building around rules as code, and then anything else you'd like to say to us in closing. So maybe I'll go Regan and then Malco and finish off with Pia before we wrap up. So Regan, what do you think about the culture shift and capacity building around rules as code?
Yeah, I guess for the capacity building, I think projects like this can hopefully drive the momentum. I think it might be the most important piece is just giving evidence, like showing what has been done, showing what is possible with this collaborative approach. And so I would point to all of these moments that we had throughout our Rules as Code sprint with the policy experts, where we were going through these regulations piece by piece and getting these aha moments from the policy experts, having them realize some ambiguities that were present when you look at it through this technical lens. So I think adding that value for the policy experts and driving that buy-in for the policy experts can really help, because you need buy-in from everybody that would be involved. They can't just be the technical side who's really excited about building these reusable systems. You also need that buy-in from the policy side. And I think through this process of doing this technical analysis, going through it piece by piece, line by line, and really analyzing it, and bringing any sort of ambiguities and highlighting those pieces of the regulation or legislation that can really drive the buy-in from those policy experts. And so just the more buy-in you have across these different layers in the organization, then I think that's going to build the engagement and push forward the momentum.
Awesome. Thank you, Malco.
Yes, thank you. This is going to be a little bit counterintuitive, but if you want to create a capacity in government to do rules code, just don't do rules code. Let me explain quickly. So my answer is autonomous multidisciplinary teams that solve public policy problems. That's how it actually came to be a thing in France. So we identified one problem, and an autonomous team of people with talent from the private sector, specifically digital talent that you need to have a way to acquire. So that is how do you build capacity, either with contracts or public tendering. There is a lot of innovation that you have to do in government in order to attract this talent. And the most effective one that I know is giving them autonomy. The first thing is getting and attracting this talent that actually are not working in startups. And then let them work in a very, very autonomous way in order to solve specific and concrete public policy problems. And at some point, when you have solved already 10 or 100 of public policy problems, you're going to start to see some patterns. And if these teams can cross-pollinate, you're going to see that Rules as Code is going to emerge by itself. So that is the order of things for me.
Fantastic. Okay, Pia.
There's a couple of things. First of all, there's a pattern of comments coming through and questions coming through about these aren't legislative experts. These are just digital folks. So to the other 2 points, to a speaker's points, and to your point, Neil, it is about multidisciplinary, collaborative, etc. But I also just want to pose you a question, almost just a counter question. These rules and legislation are meant to be and are available publicly to the general public because of access to social justice. If the assumption is that it can't be interpreted except by a legislative expert, what are we saying about access to social justice, access to personal ability for someone to understand their eligibility, their entitlement, their rights, what's available to them? I think that there's a genuine thing here about trying to actually make our rules and our laws really accessible and available for people to be able to use. And I know that some of you will then say, oh yeah, but the code's not accessible for people either. Well, that's true as well, but we can at least make a whole bunch of different applications and ways for making things more available to people. And if the only form of our rules available to people is in a heavy legalese that requires a legislative expert to help them interpret it, well, that's not really great access to social justice right there. So multidisciplinary teams isn't just about making sure the translation is right or the interpretation is right. It is also about the different skills that brings in. In Australia, they had a particular health sector regulation around health devices that came in, and the result was that particular internal devices like your pacemakers and your insulin injector things were allowed that had open Wi-Fi, open wireless access. And just in case that doesn't immediately jump out to you as to why that's a problem, it means that walking into a room, I could connect to your pacemaker and shut you down. I could connect to your insulin dependent injector and over inject and kill you. And I went to the regulators organization event about this, and they were talking about, well, our regulation was perfect. It was the implementation that was the problem. And I pointed out if they'd had a multidisciplinary team drafting it in the first place, we could have suggested that open Wi-Fi is a bad idea for an internal health device. Multidisciplinary drafting helps you actually get different perspectives, different risks identified, different opportunities identified. It actually helps you get a more reflective approach to how things are going to be implemented. But it's not just about different disciplines, it's about users of your policies. Getting the users of your laws into the room, or representatives of those users, will help ensure that the way it's going to be applied is the way that you expect. And then, of course, Stats NZ should be a partner in most of these things, because modelling shouldn't just be a matter of here's the use cases I can imagine and therefore. You should be modelling against real data, against national data, against demographics, and being able to say, if I actually take the entire, the entire populations and put it through my rules, are there groups that are being unintentionally not served? So there's some opportunities there as well. So in terms of creating capacity, that multidisciplinary approach is profound. It actually bridges the gap again between all of our functional units. We all adopted functional segmentation years ago, and it's created a problem. There's two other quick recommendations I'd make. First of all, create time and space. Just give your public servants, like everyone sort of says you have to bring in capacity from the private sector. It's not true. Just create some time and space for your public servants to innovate. If they can take a day a fortnight or a day a month to contribute their expertise and bring their whole person to the job and do something a bit outside of their day-to-day, you will unlock so much intelligence and potential and capacity and brilliance that you didn't even know was there because you've kept them locked into their job descriptions. And the final thing, of course, is the CSPS new accelerator will be a great place, I think, to incubate and help build some of this capacity and ability across the public sector. So I highly recommend it.
Amazing. Thank you, Pia. That's a great note to end things on. I just want to say thank you to our great panel of speakers. Thank you for making the time from all of your different contexts and countries to speak with us today. So we really appreciate it. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Maybe before we end, I just want to plug a couple of upcoming events that are coming courtesy of the Canada School of Public Service. We have this event on trust that features Edelman Canada. You can find that on the Canada School of Public Service website. We also have integrating a privacy-first mindset. That one is on May 7th, and that is courtesy of the Commissioner of Privacy. We also have an event on the future of public sector management, equipping institutions to better manage challenges. That's on May 18th, and that also will be a fantastic event. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for your participation today. Thank you for the Woot Clap questions. We hope you've learned about rules as code. In the thank you email for this event, we will include some links to the videos that we described, to the presentations, as well as someone asked for the link to the actual regulations. So we'll be sure to include that as well, so you can see the before as well as the after. So thank you for that as well, so you can see the before as well as the after. So thanks again to everyone, and I wish you all a great weekend.